The air in the narrow gully is thick with the smell of pine rot and stale sweat. Alara keeps her eyes fixed on the splintered handle of the water pump, her knuckles white where she grips the cold iron. 5 men form a loose, menacing semicircle, blocking her path back to the cabin. They are the dregs of the mining camp, men whose luck and humanity had run dry years ago, leaving them with nothing but bitterness and cruel appetites. Their leader, a man named Silas with a stained beard and teeth like yellowed corn kernels, takes a step closer. The grit of the earth crunches under his worn boot. "It's a simple arrangement, girl," Silas says, his voice a low, greasy drawl. He gestures to his companions, a pack of grinning hyenas. "You're out here all alone with that redskin savage. Must get lonely. We're just offering some company." "I have company," Alara says, her own voice barely a whisper, but steady. She refuses to let it shake. Silas laughs, a foul, rattling sound. "We ain't talking about him. We're talking about us. You're betting all of us," he declares, the words hitting her like stones. "Starting with me. A woman's got a duty, and a pretty little thing like you shouldn't be wasted on just 1 inch." Panic, cold and sharp, tries to claw its way up her throat, but she shoves it down. She can feel their eyes on her, stripping her bare, judging her, owning her. She is a piece of property to them, a convenience. She chances a glance over her shoulder, toward the small, sturdy cabin nestled in the pines. It's too far. He is out on a hunt, tracking deer since before sunrise. He won't be back for hours. She is utterly, terrifyingly alone. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Her mind races, searching for an escape. The gully walls are too steep to climb. The path forward is blocked by them. Her only weapon is the heavy water bucket at her feet, and there are 5 of them. Silas smiles again, sensing her fear like a wolf smells blood on the wind. He takes another step. Then a shadow fell over them all. It wasn't from a cloud. It was solid, immense, and it seemed to suck the very warmth from the midday sun. A voice, deep and resonant as stones grinding together in a riverbed, spoke a single, possessive word from behind them. "My." The change that came over the men was instantaneous. Smirks vanished, replaced by slack-jawed shock. They turned slowly, as if afraid of what they might see. Standing at the mouth of the gully, having moved with the silence of a ghost, was Cale. He wasn't just tall. He was built on a scale that made other men look like boys. His shoulders were as broad as an axe handle is long. His chest and arms corded with the kind of muscle earned from a life lived against the land. His black hair hung loose, framing a face of stark, handsome plains that was currently set in an expression of lethal calm. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on Silas, but he saw everything. He saw the fear in Alara's posture, the leering hunger on the faces of the other men, the way they had her trapped. He carried no rifle, only a hunting knife at his hip and a freshly killed rabbit in one hand. But in that moment, he was the most dangerous thing in the whole territory. Silas, recovering a fraction of his bravado, spat on the ground. "Now hold on, Apache. This ain't your concern. Just a friendly chat with the lady." Cale didn't answer. He simply dropped the rabbit and began to walk forward. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more terrifying than any charge. Each step was a promise. The other 4 men, the hyenas of the pack, began to back away, their courage dissolving under that implacable gaze. They glanced at Silas, then at the giant moving toward them, and made their decision. They scrambled away, melting back into the woods, leaving their leader to face the consequences alone. Silas's face paled, but pride and foolishness kept him rooted to the spot. "You can't just, she's a white woman. You got no right." He never finished the sentence. Cale's hand shot out, faster than a snake, and clamped around Silas's throat. He lifted the man a full 6 inches off the ground, cutting off his air. Silas's eyes bulged, his hands clawing uselessly at the unyielding grip. Cale held him there for a long, silent moment, his expression unchanging. Then, with a grunt of contempt, he threw Silas sideways. The man tumbled through the dirt and cracked his head against the wooden frame of the water pump with a sickening thud. He lay still, groaning, a trickle of blood matting his filthy beard. Cale didn't spare him a second glance. He turned his attention to Alara. The fury in his eyes softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at her. He took in her rigid stance, her pale face. He stepped forward, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he might touch her. Instead, he bent down, picked up the heavy water bucket as if it weighed nothing, and then looked back at her. His gaze moved from her face to the path leading home. It was a silent order and assurance. Go. You are safe now. Alara's breath shuddered out of her. She nodded, her throat too tight for words, and turned, walking on legs that felt like jelly back toward the cabin. She didn't look back, but she could feel his presence behind her, a solid, unmovable shield between her and the evils of the world. Their marriage had been a transaction, as cold and practical as the sale of livestock. 6 months prior, Alara had found herself orphaned and destitute in the dusty, God-forsaken town of Redemption. Her father, a failed prospector, had died of lung fever, leaving her with nothing but his debts. The town's self-appointed council, led by the saloon owner and the general store proprietor, had decided her fate. She was to be indentured, her labor sold to the highest bidder to cover what her father owed. She had stood on a crate in front of the saloon, her worn calico dress a testament to her poverty, as men appraised her like a mare, whispering about her strength for chores and her suitability for other, unspoken duties. She was 19, but felt 100 years old, her spirit worn down to a nub. She had braced herself for a life of servitude to some grimy, lecherous man. Then Cale had appeared. He had come into town for supplies, a rare event that always caused a stir. The townsfolk feared and resented him. He was Apache, a man of the people they had fought and displaced, yet he lived on a small plot of land just outside their jurisdiction, a piece of earth granted to his father by a treaty long since ignored by most. He was an outcast by birth, a specter from the wilderness they sought to tame. He had watched the grim proceedings with his impassive, dark eyes. When the bidding had stalled at a paltry sum, he had stepped forward. "I will take her," he had said, his voice silencing the murmuring crowd. "I will pay the debt." He'd placed a small, heavy pouch of gold dust on the barrel head. More than enough. Then he had added the words that had sealed both their fates. "She will be my wife." The shock had been palpable. A marriage. To him. It was scandalous, unnatural in the eyes of the town. But his gold was good, and the arrangement, however distasteful to them, absolved them of the problem of Alara. This ceremony was a brief, tense affair in the sheriff's office, a piece of paper signed and witnessed by men who couldn't look either of them in the eye. He had led her out of town without a word, his long strides forcing her to practically run to keep up. Their new home was a small, one-room cabin he had built himself. It was meticulously clean and sparse. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a single bed in the corner. That first night, he had laid out a thick bear pelt for himself on the floor in front of the fire. "The bed is yours," he'd said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. And so their life had begun, a life of shared space and profound silence. They were 2 strangers bound by a piece of paper, living in a fragile truce. He would rise before the sun and disappear into the forest, returning at dusk with game or herbs. She tended the small, struggling garden he had cleared, cooked their meals, mended his buckskin clothes, and kept the cabin. They moved around each other with a careful, practiced distance. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier some days than others. She knew nothing of him, of his past, of the thoughts behind those watchful eyes. He was a puzzle she was too afraid to solve, and she knew that in his eyes, she was likely just as much of an enigma, a fragile, pale creature from a world that despised him. A responsibility he had taken on for reasons she could not fathom. Pity? A strange sort of honor? She didn't know. All she knew was that he had never been unkind. He had never laid a hand on her, never raised his voice, never made a demand of her that went beyond the shared work of survival. He provided for her, he protected her from the elements, and now, she knew, he would protect her from men like Silas. When she reached the cabin, she went inside and sank onto one of the chairs, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear. A few minutes later, Cale entered. He placed the water bucket by the hearth and went to the basin to wash the dirt and Silas's blood from his hand. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his back still to her. No, she whispered. Thank you. You came. I heard voices, he said simply, turning to face her. They were not friendly. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoicism in his eyes. It looked like concern, sharp and deep. They will not trouble you again. It was a vow, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The invisible wall that had separated them for 6 months developed a crack. He was not just her benefactor, the man who had bought her freedom. He was her husband, her protector, and she, in turn, felt a fierce, startling surge of gratitude that was perilously close to something more. She was his wife. She belonged with him. The thought, which once would have terrified her, now felt like the only solid ground in a treacherous world. The days following the confrontation in the gully were different. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a new awareness. Alara found herself watching him more, noticing the small details. The way his hands, so capable of violence, could also be incredibly gentle as he fletched an arrow or cleaned a wound. The quiet way he would leave a handful of wild berries on the table for her, or a uniquely shaped stone he'd found by the creek. They were small, unspoken gifts, and they warmed a part of her she thought had frozen solid. She, in turn, began to bridge the gap in her own way. She took more care with their meals, using the herbs he brought back to make the tough venison more palatable. She started humming as she worked, a habit from her childhood she'd long since suppressed. One evening, she found him examining a deep gash on his forearm from a run-in with a cornered boar. Without a word, she took the bowl of warm water and clean rags and began to tend to it. He remained perfectly still, his arm outstretched, watching her face as she worked. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew more confident. When she was done, she looked up and found his eyes on her, his expression unreadable but intense. "It will scar," she said softly. "I have many scars," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He did not pull his arm away. For a long moment, her small, pale hand rested on his powerful, sun-darkened forearm. It was the first time they had touched with any kind of intention, and a current passed between them, potent and undeniable. Their fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. 2 weeks after the incident, Sheriff Barlow rode out to their homestead. He was a portly man with a perpetual sneer and a cruel glint in his piggy eyes. He did not dismount, but sat atop his horse, looking down his nose at their small, tidy world. "Cale," he said, not bothering with any pleasantries. "Got a complaint about you. Silas Blackwood says you assaulted him without provocation." Cale had emerged from the cabin, Alara a step behind him in the doorway. He stood calmly, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent mountain of a man. "He threatened my wife." Barlow scoffed. "Your wife?" he said, drawing out the word with contempt. "Silas tells a different story. Says you went wild on him for no reason. Town's getting nervous, having a savage like you living so close. Especially one who attacks white men." "He is not a savage," Alara said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised even herself. "He is my husband, and he protected me. Silas and his men cornered me. They were—" She couldn't bring herself to say the words, the shame and fear still too raw. Barlow's gaze flicked to her, dismissive and insulting. "Whatever happened, you'd be wise to control yourself, Apache. Any more trouble, and I'll round up a posse and drag you out of here myself. You understand me?" Cale's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, but he only gave a slow, deliberate nod. Barlow, satisfied that he had made his point, wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in his wake. The sheriff's visit was a clear message. The law was not on their side. They were alone, an island in a sea of hostility. That night, the weight of it settled over the small cabin. Alara couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of Cale's breathing from his place on the floor. He was in danger because of her. They had judged him for marrying her, and now they were using her as an excuse to persecute him. A wave of protective fury washed over her. He had saved her from a life of misery, and she would not be the cause of his ruin. She rose from the bed and padded softly to the hearth, where a few embers still glowed. She sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. "I should leave," she whispered into the darkness. "If I'm gone, they'll have no reason to bother you." For a moment, there was only silence. She thought he was asleep. Then, his voice came from the shadows, deep and certain. They would not stop. They hate what they do not understand. Your being here is an excuse, not a reason. He sat up, the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. You are not the cause of this trouble, Alara. You are the reason I will finish it. She looked at him, her heart aching. Why? She asked, the question she had held inside for 6 long months. Why did you do it? Why marry me? You could have just paid the debt and walked away. He was silent for a long time, gazing into the dying fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. When the soldiers came to my village, I was a boy. They burned our homes. They took my family. My sister, she was your age. I remember the look in her eyes. The same fear I saw in yours on that box in town. I was too small to help her then. He turned his head and looked directly at her, his dark eyes holding a universe of old pain. I am not small anymore. The confession hung in the air between them, a raw and honest truth that stripped away all pretense. It wasn't pity that had moved him. It was memory. It was honor. It was a vow made to the ghost of a lost sister. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, not of sadness for herself, but of a profound, shattering empathy for him. She finally understood the quiet, immense weight he carried. She crept closer, her earlier fear of him a distant memory. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm, the same one she had bandaged. You are a good man, Kale. He covered her hand with his own, his large fingers completely engulfing hers. The warmth of his skin was a comfort, an anchor. You are a strong woman, Alara. In that moment, everything changed. They were no longer a master and a servant, a buyer and a bought. They were a man and a woman, united by shared pain and a fierce, growing devotion. They were husband and wife. The next morning, Kale went into redemption for supplies, a necessary risk. Alara spent the day on edge, her mind replaying Barlow's threat. It was late afternoon when one of the few people in town who showed them any kindness, an old trapper named Jed, rode hard up the path to their cabin. You folks need to be careful, he said, his face grim as he leaned down from his saddle. Barlow and Silas have been in the saloon all day, stirring up trouble. They're telling everyone Kale is a menace, that he's holding you here against your will. They're forming a posse. They plan to ride out here at dawn, to arrest him. The blood drained from Alara's face. Arrest was a lie. It was a pretense for a lynching. Jed's warning was a death sentence. Thank you, Jed, she said, her voice tight. He nodded and rode off, leaving her alone with the terrifying news. When Kale returned an hour later, he knew something was wrong the moment he saw her face. She told him everything, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear and anger. He listened, his expression hardening into granite. We have to leave, she finished, her voice pleading. We can pack what we can and go north, into the mountains. They'll never find us. Kale looked around the small clearing, at the cabin he had built with his own hands, at the garden she had coaxed from the stubborn soil. He looked at her. This is our home, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. I will not be run from my home. We do not run. Then they will kill you, she cried, despair cracking her voice. They will try, he corrected her calmly. He walked over to her and placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm and steadying. We will not run. We will stand. Together. Looking into his resolute eyes, Alara felt her own fear begin to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. He was right. This was their home. They had built this life, this fragile sanctuary, out of nothing. She would not let men like Barlow and Silas destroy it. All right, she said, her chin lifting. We stand. But we don't just wait for them. We prepare. A new light entered Kale's eyes, respect. He saw not a frightened girl, but a partner, a warrior. What do you have in mind? For the next several hours, as dusk settled and cloaked the world in shades of purple and gray, they worked. Kale showed her how to load and fire the old rifle he kept above the mantel, his large hands guiding her smaller ones until her movements were sure. They barred the single window and reinforced the door. But their main defense lay outside. Kale was a master of the land, and Alara had become a keen observer. She pointed out the narrowness of the gully where Silas had first cornered her, a perfect choke point. She noted the dense thicket of pines to the west that could provide cover. They worked together, a seamless and silent team. He gathered rocks to build a low wall at the edge of the clearing. She filled every bucket and pot with water, both for drinking and for dousing any potential fires. As they prepared for a battle for their lives, a strange sense of peace settled over Alara. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a woman defending her home and her husband. As the last light faded, they sat at the table, the rifle between them. The cabin was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. "Alara," Cale said, his voice breaking the stillness. "There is a path behind the cabin, leading up the ridge. If they breach our defense, you will run. Do not look back." She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I am not leaving you, Cale. We stand together, or we fall together." A slow smile touched his lips, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his harsh features. "Together." Then, he reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb gently stroked her knuckles. In that simple, profound touch, a lifetime of vows was made. They would face the dawn, and whatever it brought, as one. The darkness before dawn was absolute, a cold, breathless void. Inside the cabin, Alara and Cale waited. The rifle lay across her lap, its wooden stock smooth and cool beneath her trembling hands. Cale stood by the door, a silhouette against the faint moonlight, as still and silent as the stones of the earth. He held a heavy hunting knife in one hand and a tomahawk in the other. Every nerve in Alara's body was alight, her senses stretched to their breaking point. The first sound was the distant, rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, a growing tremor that vibrated up from the ground into her bones. Cale gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. They moved outside, melting into the pre-planned shadows. Cale took his position behind the low rock wall he'd built, while Alara concealed herself in the dense thicket of pines to the west, the rifle resting on a sturdy branch. From her vantage point, she could see the entire clearing and the path leading up to it. The posse emerged from the woods like a pack of clumsy predators, a dozen men, led by Sheriff Barlow and a bandaged, vengeful Silas. They were not a disciplined force, but a drunken, angry mob, their voices loud and their movements careless. "Cale, come on out," Barlow bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet air. "You're under arrest for assault and menacing a white woman." Silence was their only answer. "Don't make us come in there and drag you out, you savage." Silas screamed, his voice high and thin with hatred. The men began to dismount, fanning out, their confidence born of numbers and prejudice. A few of them carried torches, casting flickering, monstrous shadows across the clearing. This was their first mistake. The light made them perfect targets. A low whistle, like a night bird's call, came from Cale's position. It was his signal. Alara took a deep breath, lined up her shot, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar shattered the night. She wasn't aiming for a man, but for the torch held by one of the men closest to the cabin. The bullet struck true, sending the torch spinning into a patch of dry brush, which immediately caught fire. The men yelled in surprise, their attention diverted. In that moment of confusion, Cale moved. He wasn't a man fighting. He was a force of nature. He vaulted over the rock wall and was among them before they could react. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. The tomahawk was a blur, not its cutting edge, but its flat side, cracking against wrists and collarbones with brutal efficiency. Men dropped their guns, crying out in pain and shock. He disarmed 3 of them in as many seconds. A fourth lunged at him with a knife, and Cale simply sidestepped, his legs sweeping out, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. He was a phantom, weaving between them, using their own momentum against them, never staying in one place for more than a heartbeat. From her hiding place, Alara reloaded, her hands steady now. She fired again, this time hitting the dirt at the feet of a man trying to circle around behind Cale, making him jump back with a yelp. They weren't just fighting back, they were controlling the battlefield. The posse's disorganized charge dissolved into chaos. These were not fighters, they were bullies, and their courage failed when their victims refused to cower. Barlow, staying safely at the back, drew his pistol. "He's over there. Shoot him," he roared. But it was then that Alara made her move. She stepped out from the cover of the trees, the rifle held firmly in her hands, no longer aimed at torches or the ground, but at the sheriff himself. "No," she shouted, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Every man still standing froze, turning to stare at the woman they had come to rescue. She walked forward into the firelight, her small frame radiating a strength that belied her size. Her eyes were locked on Barlow. "You will not touch my husband." Barlow stared, his mouth agape. "Girl, what are you doing? We're here to save you." "Save me?" Alara laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. "You're here because Silas Blackwood is a coward who can't stand that a woman said no to him. You're here because you hate a man for the crime of the blood in his veins." She turned her burning gaze on the rest of the posse, the townsmen who had been swept up in the mob mentality. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you. Silas and his friends trapped me. They told me I was going to service all of them. They laid hands on me, and I was terrified." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she did not stop. "Cale saved me. He protected me, as any good husband would. He is a man of more honor and decency than any of you cowards who followed this liar out here to murder him in his own home." A murmur went through the remaining men. They looked at Silas, whose face was a mask of guilt and fury. They looked at Alara, whose words rang with the undeniable power of truth. They looked at Cale, who now stood beside her, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes never leaving her face, filled with a fierce pride and overwhelming love. The posse's righteous anger evaporated, replaced by shame. They began to back away, lowering their weapons. They were shopkeepers and farmers, not murderers, and they saw with dawning clarity that they had been lied to. Barlow saw his authority crumbling. "I am the law here," he blustered, raising his pistol toward Cale. Before he could fire, Cale moved. He lunged forward, not at Barlow, but at the gun, and with a wrenching twist, ripped it from the sheriff's hand. He snapped the weapon in two over his knee, as if it were a twig, and threw the pieces to the ground. He stood over the terrified, unarmed sheriff, a giant in the flickering light, the very picture of righteous fury. But he did not strike him. "Go," Cale said, his voice a low growl, "and do not return." Defeated and humiliated, Barlow turned and stumbled back to his horse. Silas, seeing it was over, had already fled into the woods. One by one, the rest of the posse mounted their horses and rode away, melting back into the darkness, leaving only the smell of smoke and shame behind. Dawn was breaking. The eastern sky was painted in soft hues of rose and gold. The fire in the brush had burned itself out. Silence, deep and peaceful, returned to the small homestead. Alara and Cale stood together in the clearing, side by side, watching the last of the posse disappear. The threat was gone. They had won. Alara finally lowered the heavy rifle, her arms aching. Cale turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her heart stop. The warrior was gone, and in his place was only the man. A man filled with a raw, profound emotion that needed no words. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands, setting it aside. Then, his calloused hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Alara," he breathed her name, and it was a prayer. She leaned into his touch, a wave of relief so powerful it made her weak in the knees. All the fear, all the tension of the last few weeks, washed away, leaving only this man, this home, this life they had forged together in the fire. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a long time as the sun climbed above the mountains, bathing their small corner of the world in light. They had faced down the darkness and had not been broken. They went back inside the cabin. The air was still and cool. Without speaking, Alara went to the hearth and began to build up the fire, her movements sure and steady. Cale came to stand behind her, his presence a warm, solid comfort at her back. The small room, once a space of silent separation, now felt like the center of the universe. It was their home, defended and reclaimed. She turned from the fire and looked up at him. The morning light streamed through the open doorway, illuminating the lines of his face, the weariness and strength etched there. He was her husband. She was his wife. The words were no longer a contract or a convenience. They were a truth, earned in fear and courage, and sealed in the quiet promise of a new day. He reached down and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and in that simple, perfect connection, their future began. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.